Hello. Please hit like button and subscribe my channel. Also press bell icon for future video notifications. Thanks.
Last month, many microbiologists were surprised to find that the familiar names and nomenclature for the bacteria and archaea they study had been rewritten, seemingly overnight. On December 10, the National Center for Biotechnology Information, NCBI, a collection of biological databases that serves as a reference for researchers, announced that it would be updating how it classifies and names 42 phyla of bacteria and archaea. The names that microbiologists had been using to that point were rendered out of date, creating a disconnect between all previous research and upcoming discoveries. The actual decision was made earlier, and more gradually than it seemed to some shocked researchers, by the International Committee on Systematics of Prokaryotes, ICSP. The ICSP is an organization of microbiologists and taxonomy experts who maintain the International Code of Nomenclature for Prokaryotes, ICNP, a set of rules dictating how prokaryotic organisms can be named. Until this recent change, the ICNP did not pertain to the rank of phylum, the level of taxonomic organization immediately below kingdom. That left the microbiologists to their own devices, and colloquial names suggested by a given organism's discoverer took hold. It took us a long time, and it was only with the advent of molecular biology that we got to understand the true scale of the microbial world, Sutcliffe says. The change is an attempt to impose order on a vast collection of scientific research fields that, in the absence of official conventions, created a hodgepodge of unofficial phylum names. I'm very attached to not breaking interfaces, which is the effect here, Newcastle University microbial ecologist Joe Weaver tweeted on December 13, referring to the renaming of the phylum Firmicutes. Some names have remained more accurate than others, but other phylum names are simply outdated, Sutcliffe explains. But other phyla have been given drastically different names even without their contents being rearranged or split up. For example, the phylum Tenericutes is now Mycoplasmatoda. The process of updating the code began in 2015, when ICSP scientists published a paper in the International Journal of Systematic and Evolutionary Microbiology, the organization's official journal, that proposed including phyla in its nomenclature and a system for doing so. 3 years later, an expanded team of co-authors made a few slight modifications to the proposed approach. Finally, in February 2021, after what Sutcliffe calls some huffing and puffing, the issue was brought to a committee vote and passed 19-2. All phyla must now have a Latin name that ends with the suffix -oda, and the name of the phylum ought to be adopted from one of the genera within that phylum. For example, the phylum formerly known as Firmicutes was renamed to Bacilloda because it contains the genus Bacillus. At that point, researchers were permitted to submit new names for organisms or taxonomic groups in accordance with the code, Sutcliffe explains. On October 25, microbiologists Aharon Oren and George Garrity published a paper with new names for 42 prokaryotic phyla, which represented the first major attempt to reconcile the names of prokaryotic organisms with the code. https://t.co.reyh1chomjpic. Twitter. com, zedxcp na y, Gaurav Sharma, Ph.D., at Sharmag30, December 12, 2021. If you ask Sutcliffe, Garrity and Oren are among the best poised researchers to take on the task of renaming lifeforms. But University of Nevada, Las Vegas, microbiologist Brian Headland tells the scientist that the two researchers taking it upon themselves to rename such vast swaths of the prokaryotic empire justifiably rubbed some scientists the wrong way, even if he agrees with the ICSP's decisions. Don't complain. Learn the rules, and play the game. They will always be firmicutes to me, and I will pronounce it firmicuties because they are adorbs. Thanks t.co/4wme35sgnw, Heather Fega, at Fega Heather, December 12, 2021. Research upheaval. The names that drew the most ire from researchers who spoke. In Lloyd's view, shared by some others in the field, the updates to the code represent a disconnect between the ICSP and countless microbiologists who will now face a period of disruption and discontinuity in their research. What we call things doesn't matter to me, Lloyd says. I appreciate that people put thought into this, and I appreciate it's helpful to have a code when you're naming things. But all I care about is that things are practical and useful and that we can go forward and study the natural world. Lloyd tweeted her frustration that the decision means scientists will have to preserve continuity themselves by doing a deep dive on what everything used to be called. I would. https://t co WAAUTTZP7Z Karen Lloyd at Archaeorama, December 13, 2021. Other researchers, such as Georgia Tech environmental engineer Amit Pinto, were also frustrated and confused by the news. Yet Pinto, whose tweet about the update alerted many researchers, Lloyd included, to the changes, was more understanding of the ICSP's decision. My tweet was primarily driven by the inconvenience it is going to cause my own research in terms of getting used to new taxonomies. But this is not new, and if the experts agree that it is essential, then it is a good thing, Pinto tells the scientist via Twitter message. As far as I'm aware, there's not a lot of controversy about the now outdated names, Lloyd says. She suggests that it would have been better to leave them alone, given how the change will impact vast amounts of literature in really disparate fields that don't talk to each other. Despite the differences among these fields, we all use the same phyla names, she adds. I would argue that it is a quite good, organic, grassroots code that's developed. Of course, the ICSP isn't tinkering around to disrupt research and make life difficult. If they were stable, it means that we understand everything, and we just don't. Similarly, Sutcliffe says that the code is, and always was, a living document. However, he does have reservations on some of the specifics. He argues that the ota suffix of a new phylum is more important for standardization than whatever comes before it, so he suggests that a name along the lines of Proteobacterata may have been a viable compromise, at least enough so to be considered and debated, to provide continuity with the name PR. On the other hand, Headland suggests that there's no technical reason to keep the name Proteobacteria around, it's simply what the experts decided to use in the past. The future is much longer than the past in microbiology, Headland says. The question the research community needs to ask itself, he adds, is, in 100 years, in 1,000 years, do we want to be using these names for groups that would no longer make any sense in a future student or researcher's eyes? Headland adds that the criticism circulating on Twitter indicates that PEO. In the 1980s, scientists learned that 16S rDNA sequences could be used to identify and differentiate bacteria at the level of individual species. It revealed that prior names and classifications were inaccurate, leading to a revision of the nomenclature code, Headland explains. To me, that was clearly appropriate. And all the names that people are using now, that people are complaining about, losing. That's where those names came from. Headland adds that microbiology now finds itself in a second revolution, in which 16S is rendered outdated by the ability to analyze full genomes to better understand how. The names that were adopted, unofficially, as scientists made new discoveries through 16S sequencing were sometimes trivial, Garrity explains, and are not consistent with other parts of the code of nomenclature. He gives the example of Proteobacteria, which was a novel name not based on the name of. The future is much longer than the past in microbiology. Brian Headland, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Changes in nomenclature are what happens, says Sutcliffe. The science moves on, and it's like a picture that's a bit fuzzy coming into better focus. He adds that, in his experience, people do get used to it quite quickly. Looking forward, Headland says, a big question will be whether current genomic analyses hold on to their position as the gold standard. For now, the genome, I think, has to be the unit that we use to compare relatedness of organisms, Headland says. The details of how we do it will get better, but I think what we're doing now is pretty good. During the transition, researchers will have to take some extra steps to accommodate the changes in the papers they're writing or reviewing. That way, they can bridge the gap between new research and the decades of important work that preceded it. Things like this have happened before, Desert Research Institute molecular ecologist Alison Murray tells the scientist. I think it will be a bit of a bother, but when we're actually writing, we might put both names, which is how it's been done in the past. We need a language in which to communicate the diversity of life on Earth, Murray adds, and just as new knowledge forces change, accommodating those changes. The biggest gap in the ICNP, aside from the historical exclusion of phyla, stems from the requirements that scientists have to meet in order to officially name a new prokaryote. Under the rules of the code, researchers are required to cultivate pure reference samples of any new prokaryote they wish to name. They must then store samples in at least 2 publicly accessible culture collections located in different countries so that the research community can obtain subcultures for further study. We can culture between 0.1% and 1% of microorganisms, she explains. We can't give them all one culture condition and expect them to grow. Sometimes, researchers can obtain an organism's genome years or decades before they manage to cultivate it, making the ICNP's requirement that an organism be cultured all but irrelevant. The exclusion of uncultured microbes also means that researchers who conduct environmental research in the field rather than in a lab are unable to officially name their discoveries, resulting in a rapid proliferation of unofficial, inconsistent names that scientists have been grappling with for years. In 2020, a long list of researchers that includes Lloyd and Murray along with University of Nevada, Las Vegas, microbiologist Brian Headland and International Committee on Systematics of Prokaryotes, ICSP, Chair Ian Sutcliffe published a consensus statement in Nature Microbiology that laid out a path. The 2 options detailed in the paper were inclusion in the ICNP or the creation of a new, parallel code of nomenclature to pick up where the ICNP leaves off. Shortly thereafter, the ICSP voted to reject a 2016 proposal from University of Georgia microbiologist William Whitman to include uncultivated prokaryotes in the ICNP. Sutcliffe says he was in the vastly outnumbered minority that wanted to include them, forcing the researchers to choose the latter PLA. Research papers defining the SEQ code guidelines are still undergoing peer review, Headland says, but the overarching idea is that genomic data, rather than cultivated samples, will form the basis of inclusion in the code of nomenclature. Any new official names added to the ICNP will also be added to SEQ code so that the 2 systems don't conflict. It's a nice tool, Lloyd says, and an interesting approach to classification, but she adds that she's not quite ready to adopt it and throw away all of the existing concepts of taxonomy from which it departs, since the reliance on a single calculation makes the approach less nuanced than the more C. Please support my channel to grow by pressing subscribe button and the bell icon. We will notify you technological news. Thank you.